Okay, we'll go ahead and start. We kind of have a lot to cover today, so we're just going to jump into it. And if we don't get to everything, then we'll just carry through to next week. So I think everyone in here knows us, but I'll just go ahead and introduce us. I'm Jessica Deflani. I've been attending this church since I was 3 days old. Mom says I was born on Thursday. We were in church by Sunday. So I've been here for a while, taking a few breaks here and there, but I have been a member for almost 30 years. And this is my mom.
I don't really feel like I need to say anything in terms of introduction, but I did just want to say that I'm really excited to bring this series of lessons to you, and I'm really excited about what Jessica has to bring to us, and we're going to try to be as vulnerable as we can to walk you through what has been, what was Jessica's journey, and then she kind of brought me along with her journey, because we're not only mother and daughter, but we're pretty close. I would say we're pretty close friends as well. So I'm excited. I'm excited about this.
So I've kind of talked a few times about what this class is going to be. I know it's been talked about from the pulpit, but I'll just go ahead and kind of lay it out again if you have not heard. So through this class, Mom and I are going to be looking at and explaining the process of deconstruction, deconstructing your faith, from the perspective of someone who has gone through it, and then someone who was with me through it. And we're going to be pulling testimonies from other people we know and love too, so you can get a really good full picture of what deconstruction is, what it looks like, because it's a very complex thing. My journey doesn't look the same as everyone else's, so we're going to try to pull other perspectives in as well. We're going to be talking a lot about, yes, just what does it look like and what is it, but we're also going to try to tackle some of the misconceptions about it, because misconceptions do hurt the people who are going through it. I can give everyone a second to settle. No, y'all are good. I'm glad y'all are here, but I don't want to miss anything. A lot of things that are said, things that are done towards people who are going through deconstruction are very well intentioned, but they can do harm. So being able to understand that process is going to help you love your brothers and sisters a lot better, I believe. Yeah, go ahead.
And then as a parent, I know, and there's several parents in here of really young children, and then of children that are reaching age and college age. And from a parental point of view, you kind of raise your children always thinking, well, the worst thing that could happen is that I would raise my children in the church and then they would not remain faithful members as they reached adulthood. And so that's going to be kind of my perspective as having to go through as a parent, first that kind of shock and that, oh no, my worst fear has come about. But then also stepping back and being willing to say, okay, I want to walk through this with my children, and I want to know why, I want to know what, and so I hope I can be an encouragement to those of you who share that fear, and what we can do as parents to walk through that with not only our children, but that we can recognize it in other people. And like Jessica said, what approach, as the church in general, what approach does the church need to have when people are going through this process as well?
One thing that is a little different is this class is going to be largely testimonial, so it's not going to be like a scripture study like we've been used to with Haley and stuff. It's going to be a lot of our experiences, what we've learned, what God has taught us through these experiences. I will stop for a second and say, I'm probably not going to open up a open forum for questions very often through this process, through this class, just because answers to a lot of the questions y'all are going to have are going to be very complex, and they're going to be dependent on who's answering it. Like I said, my journey is not the same as everyone else's. So if you do have a question, I do want to know your questions and think about them and maybe talk to some other people. So I put a basket down here with some note cards. If you have a question, feel free to write it down and put it in there. And it may fit in with like a class we've already planned out, and I can just put it in there. Or maybe at the end we can answer some questions if it hasn't been answered by that point. I think the biggest question though right now for some of you may just be like, what is deconstruction? Like I've said this word a lot, it's been said from the pulpit now a few times, but what is it? It's a process, a long process of taking apart your belief system. And as I said at the beginning, my belief system started being built when I was 3 days old. And so taking that apart was a slow process. The best analogy I can think of is when you build a house, like I watched my parents build a house a few years ago, it's a pretty slow process. But then if you're taking it apart piece by piece, that's also a very slow process. I think a lot of people who haven't gone through it may see deconstruction as a wrecking ball, taking a wrecking ball to a house, and everything is shattered immediately. But that's, from my perspective and from a lot of the people I know and love, that was not the case for them. It was a slow process. I know for those who know me and have been here for a long time, it did look really fast, because one day I just wasn't at church anymore. And then I wasn't here for almost a year. So it did look like an overnight thing, but it wasn't at all. I'm going to stop for a second and read some of this book. Okay, so if you are going through this, or you have, or you know someone who has, one author I recommend completely is Rachel Held Evans. She has been such a comfort to me. I've learned from her. She has passed away, so there's only a few of her books. But this is the first one I read. It was called Searching for Sunday. And for me, this is what helped me realize, and I'll talk more about this next week, but stepping away from the church was actually me continuing my fight for my faith. And she kind of helped me realize that that was an okay step to take. And then this is kind of on the other side of that. And so this is inspired. And I'm not going to lie to you, I have not read this whole book. Because when I sat down to read it, I read the first 2 pages and I broke down sobbing. Because the way she describes deconstruction is so similar to how I feel about it. And so I have not read much of this book, but the little bit I have read was really good. So I'm going to read a couple pages because these couple pages sounded exactly what had been going on in my mind. Once upon a time, there lived a little girl with a magic book. Like many other books, this one told tales of kings and queens, farmers and warriors, giants and sea monsters, and dangerous voyages. But unlike any other, it cast a spell over all who read it, so they were pulled into the story, cast as characters in a great epic full of danger and surprise. From the book, the girl learned how to be brave like the shepherd boy David, clever like the poor peasant Ruth, and charming like the beautiful Queen Esther. She memorized the book's proverbs, which were said to hold the secret to a rich and happy life, and she sang the book's ancient songs just as they had been sung for thousands of years. She learned that with enough faith you could topple a giant with a slingshot, turn water to wine, and survive 3 days in the belly of a great fish. You could even wrestle an angel. She learned, too, how to defend the book against its enemies, those who said the story wasn't true. She could fashion the book into a weapon if she wanted and wield its truth like a sword. Rumor had it that the book was divinely inspired, and she believed, for every word she read echoed with the voice of God. When the girl met a teacher named Jesus in the story, she heard that voice even louder than before, so she promised to love and follow him forever. Jesus taught her to care for the poor, be kind to the lonely, forgive the bullies, and listen to her mother. He healed the sick and raised the dead, and said those who followed him would do the same. The girl never healed the sick or raised the dead, but still she believed. Then one day, the story began to unravel. The girl was older now with a mature and curious mind, and she noticed some things that she hadn't noticed before. Like how God rewarded the chosen patriarch Adam for obeying God's request that he sacrifice his own son. Abraham, sorry. I'm struggling right now. So. Or how God permitted the chosen people of Israel to kidnap women and girls as spoils of war. After the famous walls of Jericho came a-tumbling down, a God-appointed army slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the city. And after Pharaoh refused to release his slaves, a God-appointed angel killed every firstborn boy in Egypt. Even the story of all the earth's animals taking refuge in a giant ark, once one of the girl's favorites, began with a God so sorry for creating life, he simply washed it all away. If God was supposed to be the hero of the story, then why did God behave like a villain? If the book was supposed to explain all the mysteries of life, why did it leave her with so many questions? Deep down, she knew there was no such thing as crafty serpents and talking donkeys, and that you could never fit every kind of animal on earth on a boat. Science proves that the earth wasn't made in 7 days, nor has it held up by great pillars as the book claimed. There were contradictions in the various accounts of King David's reign, and even the stories of Jesus' famous resurrection didn't read like reliable newspaper reports. Perhaps, the girl reasoned, the story wasn't true after all. Perhaps, she feared, her book wasn't magic. With each question, the voice of God grew quieter and the voices of others grew louder. These were dangerous questions, they said, forbidden questions, especially for a girl. They told her to fight against her doubts, and her sword grew heavy. They told her to stand strong in her faith, but her legs grew weak. Words that were once teemed with life nettled her mind, and stories that once captured her imagination triggered her doubts and darkest fears. It was as if the roots of beloved and familiar trees had risen to trip her on her path. There was no map for a world suddenly rearranged, no incantation to light the road ahead. She was lost. So, yeah. That kind of explains what the last 10 years of my life have been like. So now I'm going to jump in and start listing some misconceptions that we hear a lot. I already kind of talked about one. It's an overnight decision. No one I've talked to overnight decided to rip apart their worldview. It's a very slow process. This one was said from the pulpit of a megachurch. And so it went across the internet quite crazily, and it did a lot of hurt to a lot of people. But it's the cool or sexy thing to do. You hear that the phrase deconstruction is fairly new, so you're hearing it a lot more lately. And so this pastor said, well, now everybody wants to do it. It's cool and it's sexy. I promise you, tearing apart my identity in my life was not cool, and it was not sexy. And then the last misconception I want to address today is that not going to church is giving up. The day I told my mom that Blake and I were going to be stepping away for a little bit, I told her, this right now is how I'm continuing to fight for my faith. I knew that if I continued to show up to here to church every Sunday, my brain was just going to be numb. My heart was going to be numb to everything. So I needed to step away for a while so that God could soften my heart again.
And Jess came to me and told me, I do believe it was outside your grandmother's garage one evening.
Sounds right.
I think that's when it was, which those of you who really know us, that's kind of ironic. But I was very stunned. And as we parted ways and I walked back over to my home, I kept trying to talk myself out of the tears that were coming and were starting to come a little bit uncontrollably. But I had never heard this word deconstruction. I did not know what she meant by this. And so one of the first things that came to my mind, which I now know is wrong, is I thought that this was just a phase brought on by extreme grief. Do you mind me?
Yeah, go ahead. It's fine.
Blake and Jessica had, when this came about, had just recently lost Blake's dad, and I want to make sure I say Blake and Jessica lost Blake's dad. Blake lost a dad, Jessica lost a father-in-law, but she also lost her education mentor, the person that had held her up, and that she always went to for advice that could be somewhat a little bit more objective than what her mother could be giving her educational advice. And so I knew that they were going through this grief that I did not understand. I could not really relate with. And so I think that's how I comforted myself at that time, is saying, okay, this is just a phase brought on by grief. But then I also started to think, well, this is just one more time that my child was just wanting to raise her children differently from the way I raised her. And I began to think that my children were deciding to raise their children outside of the church because we had raised our children in the church and we were not the parents she needed. And so, as you can see here, not only was this a painful process for Jess going through this, but it was also a very painful walk for Mark and I to go through as well. Mark copes by just kind of stepping back and observing and letting things happen. But I will say, I have grown tremendously in my faith by allowing myself and by just allowing me to walk through this with her. And so one more thing I want to say before I give it back. If a person you love dearly asks you to read a book, do it. Read the book with them. I have not, she hasn't given me this one yet. But this,
I'm ready to share this.
but Searching for Sunday is a really good book. And so I recommend it. But please, ladies, if a person you love is going through something and they want to share with you and they invite you to come along that journey with them, please do it.
So now I'm just going to tackle some phrases and sayings that those of us who have gone through this hear a lot. And I thought about not putting this section in here today because I think it's going to be hard. I think some of these things are things that we just say instinctively. And what I'm going to ask from you today is if one of these phrases or sayings that I'm telling you to use less, your first instinct is to be a little defensive and say, okay, but that's true. I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm not telling you it's not true. What I'm telling you is it's not helpful. And then a lot of times it's the opposite. It can be pretty harmful. The first one, and I actually just heard this at lunch the other day. I was with several colleagues, and we were talking about church. And someone asked one of my colleagues, well, what are you? Just talking about like, what denomination are you? And she said, well, I'm currently healing from religious hurt. And that was her way of saying, she's deconstructing. And another one of my colleagues said, well, but you do understand people hurt you, God did not. And that's something we hear a lot. We're told, remember, people hurt you, God didn't. Don't turn away from God. People hurt you, God didn't. We know that. And some people who deconstructed more than others. in my story, I don't have a lot of quote-unquote church hurt. I mean, I have some things that I will talk about next week. But for the most part, no, especially no specific person from the church ever did anything to hurt me. Nothing like that. But for a lot of people, that is the case. And when you tell them people hurt you, not God, it feels very dismissive. It's not wrong, but it feels very dismissive. It doesn't feel like you're willing to sit there in their hurt and hear them out. Similarly, something we hear a lot is when we get to discussing maybe some things that we are questioning within the system of a church. So maybe not even just a particular church like Baby Church of Christ, but just the system of organized Christian religion is, well, but the church is made up of imperfect people. So it's not going to be perfect. I don't know a nice way to say this. We're not dumb. We know people are not perfect. We know the church is made up of imperfect people. And we're people who are deconstructing or questioning are not saying we are so holier than thou that we are perfect. And since we're stepping away from the church, we're saying we're better than y'all. Okay? I don't think that's how it's ever intentioned when that's said, but that's how it feels. And it feels like we, even if we choose to stay in church, which I have chosen, I'm here, that we can't ask for anything to change. Okay? This is how it's always been done. This is how it will always be done. And we just have to accept that because the church is imperfect. And one day when we're all with God in heaven, then everything will be perfect. But for right now, you just got to deal. That's what it feels like. And then no one said this to me directly. I think this was more of just my ingrained Christianese in me that told me this. But when Blake and I decided to not come for a while, not going to church is giving up. If you do see someone step away for a while, I'm not telling you not to reach out to those people. The people who reached out to Blake and I while we were gone, that was so good. So I'm not saying don't talk to them, don't reach out to them. But please never make them feel like they are giving up. And that the answer to all their problems is coming back. I think Mom's going to hit on this, but you do have to have a little bit of trust and some faith. But please never make them think that going to church was giving up. Because for me, in that moment, it felt like quite the opposite.
I'm going to drink before I continue here. So I have used these phrases. I've actually spoken them verbally. I've said them in my head. And thank goodness, Jess and I can be very honest with me, and so she could just come right out and say, that did nothing. That did not help me at all. In fact, that hurt me. And so as I began to look at those phrases and why was that just so easily out of my mouth, God showed me that was a defensive response and a selfish perspective. I had written out all here so much of my questioning that I asked in the beginning of this journey had the words I, me, we, referring to Mark and I. What did I do wrong? What did we do wrong? I was fearful for my, reputation. Everything kind of revolved around me. And then as I was praying and just going to God and not really being able to say much other than just, what in the world? How do I deal with this? It was revealed to me that my perspective was actually very selfish, and that this process really was not about me, this process was about my children. And we'll use some information from my other daughter, one of my other daughters as well. But so God told me that I was being prideful. I was being selfish, use that word again. And so I came to the realization that I needed to repent. I needed to repent of my pride. In fact, in this book, I was flipping through it last night, going back over some of the things that I had highlighted or underlined. And a couple of times I have circled real big the word pride in there. And so I had to repent of my pride and ask God to open my eyes, my ears, and my heart to what people who are going through this process are really going through. I think we as a church too need to sometimes put numbers on the back burner and realize that sometimes the term church growth doesn't really have anything to do with numbers. It has to do with individual Christians and their struggles, and how do we as their Christian community help them grow spiritually. How do we help them confront their doubts and come out on the other side of those doubts stronger than ever? Church growth needs to mean that we as a body get stronger because individuals grow stronger.
Yeah, and pretty similarly, like before, I mean, if you looked at me 10 years ago, or even further, when I was, especially when I was in high school and then into my first few years of college, I was your stereotypical church girl. Yes, our faith should be our identity, but it was even like my shallow identity was all church, you know? And so my older sister, and we're going to talk about Megan a lot because she's given us her permission, so please don't feel defensive of Megan. She wants us to talk about her journey because she thinks that even her journey can help us a lot. But Megan stopped going to church before I did, a few years before I did. And even her not going to church, even without her not saying anything, but just knowing she was not going to church, it felt like an attack on my identity. Because I'm church girl. So if someone I love so much isn't going to church, what does that mean? So anytime people around you are asking really hard questions and even being honest about the fact that they're taking apart their faith, it's really easy to feel it as your own attack on your own identity. And I get that. But that's where you have to be very intentional about not using defensive phrases, not being on the defense. And I just think knowing you're going to be in conversation with these people, even if they're not telling you they're going through this, you're talking to people who are. Like I said, I've been going through this for 10 years. About 5 of those nobody knew, except for my husband. So just making the intention of we're not going to say things that are going to put us on the defense. We're going to be open. We're going to listen. We're going to be slow to speak and quick to listen.
I was going to say, and that slow to speak has taken on a whole new meaning for me as well. You guys know I like to talk. I'm a talker. But I always thought slow to speak was like kind of, with anger, don't speak out of anger too quickly. But what I have learned is slow to speak means we don't say meaningless platitudes to people just because we don't want to have an awkward moment. I've learned that people who are hurting in various different ways would much rather have the silent, awkward moment than to have a meaningless platitude. And being slow to speak also has begun to mean for me is that I take the time to ask the Holy Spirit, is this a time for me to speak? And if this is a time for me to speak, give me the words. Because human words are inadequate.
I'm going to take a few minutes here and read some responses I got. I posted last week on Instagram, just putting it out there, like for anyone who's gone through deconstruction, what was that process like? And I think it's so funny because in my post I asked about it. I asked if you could sum it up in 1 or 2 sentences. Nobody sent me 1 or 2 sentences. Everyone who sent me a response, it was like a book. I want to read some of those to you. I am in no way saying everything they say is correct, because there are some things in there that even as someone who has gone through it, I don't necessarily agree with. However, I do think it's important to understand what is happening in the mind and the heart of these people. Especially, I'm not going to name names, but I will say the responses I'm about to read are people who a lot of us in this room have known and loved. And I did that on purpose because I want you to know that. Because like I said earlier, there are a lot of people around you who are going through this, even if you don't know it. Okay, so this is the first one. She said, my process seemed much more gradual than most. I think I started deconstructing in college once I stepped away from my home church and started getting real Bible study on an academic level, while also experiencing God outside of church as a counselor at church camp, mission trips, etc. As you begin to see God and the Holy Spirit working in holy and magical ways outside of the church building, seeing people's lives transformed by His love and my love, I began to question the church and faith traditions I grew up with. The cognitive dissonance began to grow. The more I came to know the Trinity as the Trinity, as active being out in the secular world, I began to realize how not only not important but also harmful my church practices, beliefs, and traditions were. I don't think I ever deconstructed all the way to the very bottom and had to rebuild from scratch. Metaphorically, I seem to deconstruct rooms of the house one at a time, so that the house itself always stood firm. In the most recent years, I had to discern who was safe to trust, considering my faith in church. Many churches feel unsafe or have beliefs that cause more dissonance with who I know God to be and what the church is preaching / saying or practicing. I often feel unequally yoked with other believers because of this. And then she just says that she's traveling right now, so she doesn't really have a church community, and she doesn't really know where she stands in her deconstruction process, but she is continuing to learn more. So, and then here's another one. He said, for me, it was hard. It was a slow unraveling, not necessarily like a moment in time or a decision. So you're seeing some common themes here. Even if you want to leave something behind, especially if it's fueled by resentment or anger, that doesn't mean you still don't love it, or you don't love it still. As Oasis says, though, don't look back in anger. My hunch is that there's this misconception among them, and by them he means people still in the church, that deconstruction is sort of tied to an arrogance of sorts, that people who are deconstructing know better or are self-righteous. In my experience, it was pretty humbling and disorienting. So that goes what I said too. Next week, I'm going to share my full story, starting from childhood, because I keep saying 10 years, and yes, that's when it really really started. But there are things throughout my whole life that kind of led me to this point. So I will go through that next week, along with I will share more of my sister's testimony that week also. It's not really time to be done, but I do want to leave you with a prayer or my prayer for this church. Go
Well,
ahead.
I actually, while you were going through that, and she gave the metaphor of the building of the house. During this time, Allie was expecting Harper, her second child, and she gave a changing table. She had it, and she had done some work on it. It was a changing table that my dad had made when I was expecting Jessica. And Allie took it when she was expecting Henry, and it was a stained pretty wood oak stain, and Allie wanted it painted. But she didn't really know how to paint it right, didn't know how to go through all the processes. And so she just gave it a little bit of a sanding and then put some paint on it. But then when she had Harper, she decided she wanted it back to wood. And so Mark and I went up and got it, brought it back to my dad. And watching my dad try to restore that changing table back to its original really spoke to me. One day I was in his shop watching him work, and I actually came to tears. And I said, Dad, I said, it would have just been easier to build a whole new changing table, wouldn't it? And he said, yeah. He said, it's hard to bring something back to its original beauty when somebody else has put their mark on it. I was just like, wow. Wow. To me, that really spoke to and began to open my eyes to what Jess was going through.
So my specific prayer for this class is that through my story, through Mom's story, through other people's stories, our hearts and our minds are going to be opened past